Okay, so I'm going to walk through my book today. I'll see if I can touch on all 12 of the rules. It probably won't happen because I usually get like obsessed with one of them partway through, but I'm going to try anyway. So, and I'll start with rule 1, logically enough, which is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And I'm actually going to start by talking about a different book. I've been reading this book over the last couple of weeks called The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. That's The Great Leveler. I would really recommend this book, by the way. Since you've already bought mine, I can recommend another one. The reason I bought this book was because I had this client once in my clinical practice. He was a fascinating guy. He was an old guy. And he'd come to me because he was completely obsessed with mathematics and he couldn't get it out of his mind. And he had some other issues as well. And he did all sorts of interesting things. He made these little gold pins out of the world's most beautiful equation, and he used to hand them out to students. And he had studied psychology and he had studied finance. And I think I learned more from him in my dealings with him in the therapeutic context than he learned from me. That's not that rare if you're a clinical psychologist, because, you know, if you're talking to people deeply, the probability that you're going to learn something from them is unbelievably high. And so I think probably if you're not learning something from your clients every time you talk to them, then you're probably not on the right track from a therapeutic perspective. And I kind of allude to that in rule, I think it's rule 9, which is assume that the person that you're listening to knows something you don't, which is a very good rule. Anyways, he introduced me to this thing I've talked about an awful lot, which was a principle derived by an Italian economist named Vilfredo Pareto. And Pareto was the person who formulated the Pareto principle, which is that it's a very terrible principle. It's the principle that if you have 10 employees, then 3 of them do half the work. It's a square root principle, fundamentally. And the square root principle seems to apply to every single domain where there's creative variability in human endeavor. But it also seems to apply to domains outside of human endeavor and even living endeavor altogether. It applies to the population of cities and the mass of stars, for example, which seems to make it a principle that goes beyond, well, certainly beyond the sociological, beyond the biological. It's grounded deeply into the physical. And anyways, the square root law goes something like this. So the square root of the number of people in a given domain do half the productive work. And so, or reap half the benefit. You think, well, all right, if you have 10 employees, then 3 of them do half the work. That's not that surprising. If you have 10 employees, one of them is probably not doing that well, and the other 2 are sort of, dragging their feet. The other 3 might be making enough money to pay their own wages, and then you have 3 that are productive enough so that they're really running the entire enterprise. So 3 out of 10, that's not too bad. That's not that much less than 50%. But if it's 100, then 10 of them do half the productive work, and if it's 1,000, then it's 30, and if it's 10,000, then it's 100. I mean, so what happens is, in enterprises, competence grows linearly and incompetence grows exponentially. Right. And you just cannot overstate the seriousness of this. It's absolutely, it's why I think the story of the Tower of Babel exists at the end of chapter 1, or the first part of Genesis. If something gets too big, it will absolutely collapse. And the reason for that is that competence grows linearly and incompetence grows exponentially. And so you remember in 2008, everyone said too big to fail. It's like, no. So big, it must fail. And I think this is actually a place where the right and the left could agree if they got beyond their partisan differences, because, of course, the right is very, very suspicious of big government, and the left is very, very suspicious of big government. And you might think, of big business, and you might think that someone canny would stand back and say, well, look, the common denominator there seems to be big. And that's very much worth pointing out. Now, this old guy, he told me about the Pareto principle, and it solved a problem that I had encountered in my research. I was doing research with Shelley Carson and Daniel Higgins. We started this research at Harvard in the 90s, and we were very interested in the measure of creativity. And creativity, like many commonly utilized descriptive terms, is very difficult to nail down from a scientific perspective, because to nail down something from a scientific perspective, you really have to put it in a categorical box, right? You can't, if I use the word creativity in a normal conversation, you can pick up what I mean from the context of the conversation. But if I make a measure of creativity, then it has to be very, very tightly defined. And it turns out that defining something like creativity is a lot more difficult than you might think. So, because one of the things you could say is, well, people think creatively. Maybe you're a creative thinker. Is that creativity? Well, or you might think, well, no, that's not enough. Creativity isn't merely the ability to think creatively. You have to produce something that's novel and useful, which is a fairly common definition. Creative people produce things that are novel and useful. There were quite a few measures of creative thinking already established in the psychometric literature. One of them is the Torrance creativity test. Is quite widely used. It's actually a pretty good predictor of creative endeavor, as it turns out. So with the Torrance tests, you're asked, for example, to write down as many uses as you can think of for a brick in, I think it's 5 minutes, I don't remember the exact amount of time, and then you're scored for absolute number of responses, the more the better. That's a straight fluency measure, that's called a fluency measure. And then the other thing that you're scored on is relative rarity of your response, as long as it still fits within the domain of both novel and useful. And so that would be creative thinking. And fluency measures are also measures of extroversion and trait openness from a Big Five perspective. And so you can tell, like if I got like about 400 of you here, if I all had you write down as many words as you can that begin with the letter S in 90 seconds, and we rank ordered you by how many words you generated, we'd get a rough rank order of your creativity as well. And some estimation of your verbal intelligence, but it would be a better measure of creativity, at least creative thinking. And creative thinkers think laterally. And so what happens if you're a creative thinker is you'll have an idea and then it'll give rise to a bunch of other ideas. So you have loose associational networks. That's another way of thinking about it. You know, someone who's not creative, if you toss them an idea, another idea won't rapidly spring to mind. Or if it does, it'll be an idea that's quite close semantically to the original idea. Whereas if you're a creative person, you'll hit an idea and you'll jump way over here, and that'll remind you of something way over here, and that'll remind you of something way over here. And a lot of creative thinking is bad thinking. You know, well, it is. Look, I mean, it's an important thing to know if you're a creative person, because it's really hard to monetize creativity, right? Because first of all, most of your ideas are bad. They're just not well thought through. You haven't criticized them. Even if they're good ideas, the probability that there's a market for them is quite low at that time and in that place. And like, what do you know about marketing anyways? And then you have to communicate them. And like, it's really, the pathway from creative idea to profitable creative product is so long that it's almost never that the originator of a creative idea monetizes it. And so that's a very dismal proposition for people who are creative. It's very, like, creative people generate all the new ideas, right? But they hardly ever monetize them. Other people monetize them. So it's a hell of a thing to be a creative person, except that it's interesting. Anyways, that's the thing. That's the payoff, right? It's interesting. You have an interesting life if you're a creative, maybe too interesting. When we had been studying, so we decided to study creative achievement. We put together this questionnaire called the Creative Achievement Questionnaire. And what we did was we identified 13 dimensions of potential creative production. Things like culinary, architectural, entrepreneurial, financial, dance, drama, art, literature, etc. I think there was an invention category. Anyways, we covered the creative domains pretty well. And then we had experts. We ranked different, what would you call it, strata of accomplishment. So 0 would be, I have no training or recognized talent in this area. And like 10, I think it was on a 10-point scale, would be, you know, I've won an international prize for my work in this area. And then we gave it to many, many, many people and looked at IQ as a predictor. IQ is a very good predictor, by the way. IQ predicts almost everything that involves complex cognitive operations. And IQ is the most powerful predictor social scientists have ever found for anything, period, by a factor of about 4. There's one exception. The correlation between inequality and male homicide is about 0.9, and that's the highest correlation between two things I've ever seen. But other than that, it's IQ. And so IQ was a good predictor. Trait openness in the big 5 sense was a good predictor of creative ability. But one of the things we found was that the distribution of creative achievement was not normal. You know how a normal distribution works is most people are at the average, and then a few people are at the tails. And that applies to IQ, and it applies to height, it applies to weight, and it applies to the big 5 traits. And there's a truism in psychology that most phenomena are normally distributed. A truism in statistics, actually, that most phenomena are normally distributed. But creative achievement is not normally distributed. And neither are any of the phenomena that are associated with creative production in general, including the distribution of money, for example. You know, the 1% has a tremendous, the 1% has a disproportionate amount of wealth. And then if you take the 1% of the 1%, they have a disproportionate amount of the wealth that the 1% has, so that it's something like 85 people have as much money as the bottom 2.5 billion. It's something like that. And you think, well, that's a terrible indictment of the capitalist system. And no, it's not, by the way, because the problem of inequality, which is a real problem, is way more serious and difficult than the problem of capitalism. Because inequality is a much more fundamental phenomena, because it manifests itself in all sorts of areas that have nothing to do with sociology or politics or economics. It manifests itself everywhere. Now, and what we found with the creative achievement questionnaire was everyone stacked up at 0. It's like across the 13 dimensions, 70%, 70% of people scored 0, and about 10% scored 1. And and you could easily score like 60. People scored 60 on the creative achievement test, so the distribution looked like this. Everybody stacked up at 0, and there's a few people out here, and they were doing everything. And that's what you see. You see that in scientific publications. You see it in hockey goals scored. You see it in number of compositions written. Like how many classical compositions have you written? 0, right? None. Right. And then you have J.S. Bach, who wrote so many classical compositions that if you hired a competent copyist just to copy what he composed, it would take them 40 years of 8-hour days. So that's J.S. Bach. And then Picasso, here's an example. So Picasso, you're no Picasso, well that's for sure. How many paintings have you painted? 0. How many paintings did Picasso paint? Artworks. How many artworks did Picasso produce? 65,000. Right, so 3 a day, every day, for 65 years. Right, and think about it, it's just absolutely beyond comp. And these were Picassos, right? Right, no, but I'm dead serious. You think, yeah, he's whipping off some sketches. It's like, no. You can go online, you can find the online Picasso archive. And there's 15,000 of his pieces of art. Last I checked, which was a couple of years ago, it's probably more like 20,000 now. And it's just staggering. You know, you just cannot believe that someone could possibly do that. And really, that's the way of the world. And so this old guy, he told me about the Pareto distribution, and that blew me away to begin. So that explained the creative achievement questionnaire distribution, because we didn't know. It's like, what the hell? This is supposed to be normally distributed. It's not even, it's not normally distributed at all. Everybody stacks up at 0, which is like a rule to remember. The proclivity is for everyone to stack up at 0. And well, why? Well, 0 is easy, right? You just don't have anything. It's like that's the natural state of things, is to not have anything. And so it's not surprising that people stack up at 0. What's surprising is that some people don't. And then what else is surprising is how unbelievably hyperproductive people are. It's just beyond belief. I mean, Nikolai Tesla, who invented alternating current, that actually turns out to be a big deal. He invented the electric motor and the electric generator, among endless other inventions. He said that whole inventions would pop into his mind in one burst, right down to the angle of the screws, or the screws that held the mechanisms together. And sometimes he would invent things so quickly that he couldn't get one written down before another would pop into his head and obliterate the previous one. And Mozart as well played, and Mozart was a little more understandable because he was unbelievably highly trained by his father as well as being a prodigy. But he said whole symphonies would pop into his head at once, and it was just a matter of trying to get it down. You know, and so So creative achievement is really something. And it's not like we understand it, but it's rare. And the people who are really good at it are prolific beyond belief, you know. And so when you hear about the 1% having all the money, you think, well, that's a side effect of some pathological system. It's like, no. Don't get oversimplified about this. It's a big problem. Now, anyway, so this old guy, he explained to me part of the reasons that the Pareto distribution emerged, say with regards to the money. And so it's complicated, and this is why Walter Scheidel's book is also extremely useful. I mean, one of the things that seems to happen is that IQ has nonlinear effects. So, and you can imagine why that might be, because if you're the first person to get somewhere, then, except if you're creative, but if you're the first person to get somewhere, then you're more likely to benefit disproportionately from getting there, because you're the first person. And so, if you have a high IQ, then you're faster than everyone else. And then if you align that also with the fact that you're going to network with other high IQ people, which is exactly what's happening in Silicon Valley, for example, then that starts to become exponentially more worthwhile. And that's the thing, too, is that this is also associated with the Pareto distribution. There's another kind of iron law of economics, which is a very sad law. They call it the Matthew principle, often, which is an allusion, oddly enough, to a New Testament statement. And the New Testament statement is, to those who have everything, more will be given. And from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. And that's sort of aligned with another New Testament statement, which is, the poor will be with us always. I think, well, those are pretty strange statements for what purports to be an ethical document. But I think what they do is to point to something that's very, very deep about the way that wealth is both generated and distributed. And so there's nonlinear advantages to, say, having a higher IQ. There's potentially nonlinear advantages to having higher rates of conscientiousness. There's potentially nonlinear effects to being a creative thinker. But then once you start being successful, like you might think you start being successful and then it's a linear trend upwards. Or you start failing and it's a linear trend downwards. But it doesn't look like it graphs that way. It looks like as you start being successful, each success makes the next success more probable. So it looks like this. And as you fail, each failure makes the next failure more probable. So it looks like this. So there's scaling up on one side, rapid, and there's falling off a cliff on the other side, equally rapid. And so that's the Matthew principle, and those things operating together seem to produce this Pareto distribution. And the problem with the Pareto distribution, as Marx pointed out 120 years ago, he thought it was attributable to capitalism, is that capital, say, tends to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer individuals. Now, Marx was right about that, but Pareto had already figured that out. I think Pareto predated Marx, although I'm not absolutely certain of that. I'm hoping that it's true anyways. But Marx wasn't pessimistic enough, and modern-day left-wingers aren't pessimistic enough either, because, of course, what drives politics on the left is the observations of inequality and the potentially catastrophic effects of inequality, and there are potentially catastrophic effects of inequality. That's the thing. That's also well documented. So if you're a good social scientist, you should know something about the Pareto distribution. You should know something about the fact that creative achievement is a nonlinear process, so is success. You should know something about the fact that IQ predicts lifetime performance, as does conscientiousness, although not nearly as well. And that there's this proclivity for success to cascade and for failure to cascade. But you should also know that, and I think this is credible evidence, that as inequality increases, as it seems to do inexorably, societies themselves destabilize. So I mentioned earlier the two correlations that I know of that are very large. One is IQ predicting life success, and the other is Margaret Wilson and Martin Daly, at McMaster University. These are the first people who discovered this. It was shocking research when I first came upon it, because I'd never seen anything that was this powerful in the social sciences. So they were interested in what drives male homicide. And I had studied aggression in males. Well, males are more aggressive than females. And I'll talk about that in a little while. It's not a huge difference, by the way. So if you took a random woman and a random man out of the population, and you had to bet on who was more aggressive, and you bet on the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. So there's a huge amount of overlap between men and women with regards to aggression. and this is another thing you might want to understand, it's really important to understand this, is that two groups can be very similar with walloping differences at the tails. So here's an example. So let's say the overlap between men and women is substantial with regards to aggression. But let's say we don't care about aggression except when we're talking about the person who's the most aggressive out of 100. And you can imagine that would be the case because you don't really care if someone's aggressive as long as they don't come into your house with a gun, right? They can be pretty damn aggressive, but when they cross that line into outright aggressive criminality, then they've hit a threshold, and that threshold essentially means incarceration. So you might say, well, what proportion of men are the most aggressive people? And the answer to that is something like 9 out of 10. It depends on how you slice it, obviously. But the more aggressive the slice, the higher the proportion of men. And that's why 9 out of 10 people in prison are men, even though on average men and women don't differ that much in aggression. And so it's really important as well, and this should be taught, sort of basic statistics, somewhat sophisticated I would say, but that kind of statistics needs to be taught to people in junior high and high school, because otherwise you can't understand easily the way the world works. You can't understand how men and women can be mostly the same, but they can still be really different at the extremes, and a lot of activity occurs at the extremes. You can say the same thing about men in engineering and women in nursing. So the evidence on this is becoming increasingly clear. First of all, the more gender equal the state, the bigger the difference in interest between men and women. Now, it's exactly the opposite of what social scientists assumed they'd fucking 25 years ago, because we assumed, everyone assumed, and hoped perhaps, that as you made societies more gender neutral in their sociological structure, that the personality differences between men and women would decrease. That's not what happened. They maximized. And it's because you take all the environmental variability out of the equation, you're left with nothing but biological variability, and it maximizes. And so there's a new paper that was just posted today on exactly this topic, showing that the most gender neutral countries have the biggest differences in educational choice. And so it's really interesting, and you see our damn government keeps rattling the cage about STEM fields and about how the fact that women are underrepresented in STEM means that there's sociological bias. All the bias, by the way, in terms of hiring with regards to STEM fields is in favor of women now. The empirical data on that is absolutely crystal clear. And so whatever's driving the difference in hiring, and there isn't undergraduate rates of graduation either. And it's not proficiency, because if you look at proficiency in mathematical reasoning and scientific ability, mathematical reasoning in particular among junior high kids, women and men or girls and boys, basically indistinguishable. And if you follow up high achieving women from junior high who are disproportionately intelligent in mathematics, what happens is they don't go into mathematics or into the STEM fields because they're not interested in it. It's not because they can't do it. It's a really important thing to know, right? It isn't differences in ability that's driving this. It's difference in interest, and the difference in interest between men and women are the biggest psychometric differences that we know of between the genders, bigger than personality differences, for example, which are also big enough to have walloping effects at the tails, although not that big at the average. So anyways, back to this old guy. He said to me, he'd been thinking a lot about the Pareto distribution, and his theory was there are a lot of factors that drive the distribution of wealth, because he was most concerned about wealth. But what happens is that as a society ratchets forward, the proclivity for wealth to distribute itself unequally mounts and mounts and mounts and mounts until there's so many people stacked up at zero that they flip the board over, because zero is a really difficult place to escape from. You know, you can fall into a poverty trap where you're so poor that nothing you do gets you going. You can't get any traction. You kind of know that if you ever try to start a business, because the most difficult customer to find for your business is the first customer. It's disproportionately difficult. Once you find one, the second one is way easier. And once you have 100, it's like, well, the 101st is relatively simple. But that first paying customer, yeah, good luck with that, man. It's virtually impossible. So his idea was that and I can tell you some other interesting things about this too. He turned me on to the work of a group of people called econophysicists, and I thought, what? Econophysicists? Those people don't exist. And yeah, they do, by the way. And you can go look online, and they have interesting animations, the econophysicists. And one of the things they do here's a way of imagining how wealth distributes itself. So imagine that I gave everybody in the room $10. Okay, so you all have $10. And so you're at a state of maximal equality, right? And now you start to engage in a trading game. And it's a simple trading game. You just go up to someone and you flip a coin, and if it's heads, then you buy a fictional banana from them and eat it, and you give them $1. And so you walk away with 9 and they walk away with 11. And you just keep trading. Okay, so what happens first is that the stack, imagine a graph. Everyone's stacked up at $10. Now you start to trade. Just as many people win as lose. So you get a normal distribution first. But then, after 10 bad trades, some poor sucker has 10 tails in a row, and then they hit 0. Well, what happens when you hit 0? You're out of the game, man. You're done. And so then everyone keeps trading. So what happens? Well, the distribution starts to turn from a normal distribution. This tail starts to stack up. As people stack up at 0, the 0 is mound. And then the number of people who are winning the trades gets smaller and smaller and smaller until one person has all the money. Now you know that because you play Monopoly. Right? That's what happens in a Monopoly game. The game is over when one person wins everything. And so you can model this. So this is such a robust phenomenon that you can model it with a Monopoly game. And so we really do understand this. Now the problem is, well, the problem that my old clients said, well, the problem with regards to the proclivity of money to distribute itself in that manner, with regards to the econophysicists, so that was one of the graphs they produced. They also showed that money tends to distribute itself in a society and can be modeled by the same equations as gas distributing itself into a vacuum. That's another example of how fundamental a problem this is. This is a fundamental problem, and it can't be hand-waved away with some reference to, the vagaries of political systems. So that was his hypothesis, is that, well, the game kept going until too few people won everything, and then there'd be a revolution, because the people at the bottom, especially the angry young males, because they're very status conscious, and if they can't lift themselves off the bottom rung, then they're not interesting to women, and so they're not in the dating game, the mating game at all, and that makes them hyper-aggressive, and that's what's driving the correlation between male homicide and inequality, which is about 0.9, as I said. So if you go to counties across, this is between countries and within countries, by the way. It's absolutely robust data. And so what you find is if you go places where everyone's poor, the men aren't violent. And if you go places where everyone's rich, the men aren't violent. But if you go places where there's a steep gradient between rich and poor, so neighborhoods that are mixed economically, let's say, then the male homicide rate starts to ratchet up. And you can imagine that it's the most aggressive males by temperament that get most aggressive soonest as inequality increases. So there's still a psychological component, but what's driving it fundamentally is inequality. And so the reason when I first, that was Martin Daly and Margot Wilson's work. They're both Canadian, they're at McMaster, and brilliant work. They also demonstrated, because they studied homicides in Chicago in the inner cities, and they concluded that for a typical inner city dweller in Chicago, homicide was an effective status move with regards to moving yourself up the hierarchy. Because you be in a within race competition, first of all, because most murders occur within race, and so most of that was dominance dispute, and you plea bar, and then if it was the sort of fight that turned into a murder, the sort of dispute that turned into a murder, you could claim self-defense, plea bargain it down to manslaughter. You'd be in jail hypothetically for 3 years, but you'd get out after 18 months, and your street cred would rise enough so that it was actually a viable economic decision. It's harsh modeling, right? Like real social science produces results that no one likes. That's how you can tell. That's how you can tell if the findings are real. If you're a social scientist and you go, oh no. Yeah, it's really the case. And that's why I think you can trust the gender data on personality, by the way, because it's a truism that the social sciences are left-leaning. That's to say the least. They're left-leaning. And so the fact that social scientists have found that gender differences in personality maximize in egalitarian societies, like that's rock-solid data. Because no one was like having a party when they discovered that. No one was going, oh, that's exactly what we're hoping. Isn't it good we got that out of the data? It's like, no, that can't be right. We better quadruple our sample size and do 10 more analysis. Oh, there it is again. Oh, well, I guess we have to publish this. That's the lines of thinking. So another example of that, I would say, is this is also with regards to inequality, is that I spent a lot of time reading the IQ literature. I started that about 20 years ago, and I was reading that because, well, I was interested in what predicts human performance across time, and IQ definitely does. IQ measures, by the way, they're very easy to design. So I'll tell you how to make an IQ test. It's real simple. So imagine that you had a universal library of questions. I don't care what kind of questions they are. Mathematical puzzles, verbal puzzles, general knowledge, vocabulary, like any sort of question that someone could answer and that maybe some people couldn't. So they'd have to be questions with a certain degree of difficulty. So imagine you have 100,000 questions like that. You just throw them in a pile. And then you randomly select 100 of them. And then you give them to 400 people. And you tally up their scores and you rank order the scores. That's IQ. Not exactly. You should correct for age. But forget about that. Fundamentally, that's IQ. And then what you find, so you took those 100 random questions and you gave them to everyone. You rank ordered their performance. Let's say you pulled out another 100 and you gave them to the same 400 people and you produced another rank order, right? And you correlated the two rank orders. You'd find that the correlation was about 0.93, something like that. So the people who did really well on the first 100 set of questions are overwhelmingly likely to be the people who do very well on the second set of 100 questions. And that's all there is to IQ. That's the whole damn picture. Now, and that predicts long-term life success with enough potency. So imagine you were picking people for a job and used an IQ test to pick them, or you chose them randomly. So if you chose them randomly, there'd be a 50% failure rate. If you chose them with an IQ test, there'd be a 25% failure rate. And so it's a walloping effect. And everyone knows that. I mean, really, you know perfectly well that complex cognitive operations are easier for smart people. It's like that's just not that staggering a realization. Everyone knows that, right? But we're not so happy about the corollary, which is that complex cognitive operations are very, very difficult for people who aren't smart. We don't like that. And no wonder, it's no wonder, right? Because it's a terrible thing.